In the coming days, we may get more clarity on the U.S. policy front. Famous last words. The Supreme Court has numerous decision days scheduled that could uphold or create an upheaval on Trump's tariff policies. President Trump is also preparing for his upcoming State of the Union address, all while attention starts to shift to the all-important midterms. And who better to discuss these than Chris Krueger, Managing Director at TD Cowen Washington Research Group. But he's here in person. It's nice to have you here in person.
It's great to be in Toronto.
I think you're the hardest working man right now in this, because every time something happens, I mean, it's been, they say sometimes nothing happens for decades, and then yes. Everything happens. Of course, I mixed the metaphor already. So
it's Lenin. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go. So let's start with moving in chronological order. Right. I mentioned this decision days is coming up with the Supreme Court. First, what is that for those who don't know, and what are you expecting? Right.
So this is the fourth opinion day of the year from the Supreme Court. So the IEEPA case, this is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. President Trump used this authority for the first time ever to impose the so-called fentanyl tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China. These are the Liberation Day tariffs. Oral arguments were in November, early November, and we've been waiting since then. So the decision could come this Friday. If it doesn't come this Friday, sort of the deadline is late June, early July. Coming out of those oral arguments, we were pretty surprised how critical a number of the conservative justices were, particularly Justice Gorsuch, who was President Trump's first nominee to the court. So the expectation was that we would get a decision on the IEEPA tariffs by year end. We haven't. I've had to schedule stuff around these opinion days, and then you're hitting the refresh button, and it's not IEEPA. Incidentally, they come around 10:05 a.m. to 10:10 a.m., so we'll see. Best guess on this, though, is that we're not going to get clarity. It's probably going to be a muddled decision. The thinking here is that coming out of those oral arguments, it just seemed pretty binary, that the IEEPA statute was going to be thrown out and these tariffs would be eliminated. Because we've kept going on and now there are questions, one of the bigger questions is refunding. Also, a number of reciprocal frameworks have been hammered out under the IEEPA statute since those oral arguments. So
there's been structural changes to how trade works, therefore?
Therefore, it wouldn't surprise me if on the rebate question they kick it to a lower court. It wouldn't surprise me if some of the tariff authorities were upheld. Maybe the so-called fentanyl tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, and maybe the Liberation Day tariffs roll off. Bigger picture, there are numerous other statutes available to the administration that we believe are probably ready to go within 24 hours.
Right, so even if IEEPA tariffs are said that they're not legal, they'll find a different way to do it.
Right, I mean, one of the issues is that the word tariff does not exist in the IEEPA statute. Something to keep an eye on, though, the word license does. In the Davos speech, President Trump specifically cited that word. Secretary Besant has mentioned it. So there's a thought that IEEPA tariffs will be disallowed, but IEEPA import licenses will be allowed.
Right, right.
So it's sort of a game of semantics. Yeah. Bigger picture, tariffs are here to stay.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a bit about the State of the Union. I think if we go in chronological, is that next?
It's next Tuesday.
I know there's something every minute, but is that, okay, yeah. In terms of scheduled things that we know about. What are you going to be listening for in the State of the Union?
Well, I'm going to be hopeful that there is a State of the Union because the Department of Homeland Security shut down earlier this month. So there's some question as to whether or not President Trump will give a State of the Union during a part of the government being shut down. In 2019, then Speaker Pelosi and President Trump got into a fight over the State of the Union. It was actually postponed. So Homeland Security will remain shuttered probably until the end of next week at the earliest.
And sorry, just explain this like I'm 12. So why, is it just because there's an ongoing issue, or is there other reasons he wouldn't have the State of the Union then?
Well, there's some thought that, there are 270,000 employees who are being furloughed, Secret Service, Coast Guard, FEMA are not being paid. Yeah. The optics, et cetera.
Not great. Yeah.
The State of the Union is not fully open.
Yeah, yeah.
What a number of House and Senate Republicans up for re-election What they are anxious for President Trump to deliver is a really powerful message on affordability, because affordability is really the coin of the realm. That is what is driving American politics right now. State of the Unions are very challenging, though. You have about 90 minutes to basically talk about all policies. So we did get, I think, a preview in that Davos speech, and we'll stay tuned. Typically, a few weeks after the State of the Union, we get the budget. So that'll be kind of the next big thing.
What were some of the clues that you got in Davos that you think would show up in the State of the Union? You mentioned licenses versus tariffs. That's some language that happened. What else did you hear?
I mean, there's a concern with House and Senate Republicans that the legislative agenda is basically concluded. Last summer, they passed the One Big Beautiful Act. There's another reconciliation bill available to Republicans. President Trump has said he doesn't think that that's required. So the thought of sending out stimulus checks or increasing the defense budget by 50%, these kind of things, those aren't going to happen without a reconciliation budget. So what we saw in Davos wasn't so much new policies, it was more sort of pointing the finger at sort of, straw men, perhaps, right? So is it going to be, how do we solve the affordability crisis or the affordability issue? Or are we going to blame certain people for that, whether it's hospitals or health insurers or, et cetera.
And I was going to say, just on that too, on the narrative on the affordability side, is there a good narrative to tell? I mean, you sometimes see inflation numbers, but then again, you're saying, look, who do we blame if we don't get the narrative we want?
Well, look, it's without question, when you look at the off-cycle elections last year, right, and it was a range of different Democratic candidates from, Mamdani in New York to Spanberger in Virginia, to a couple weeks ago when a Fort Worth, Texas state Senate seat flipped by 30+ points.
Yeah.
Right? This is the district that is literally the Cowboys stadium, right? Affordability was just the linkage across the board there. Stay tuned. But yeah, it's you're seeing too that eggs were sort of eggs were in U.S. politics kind of the benchmark.
Yep.
Now they're saying it's utility bills, right? So we've seen President Trump sort of pushing on AI and others because the data centers take a lot of power, they take a lot of water.
Chris, we were talking about State of the Union and just some affordability being the big one. Again, you want to do that before you have the midterms happen, which are coming next. What are you expecting to see? Because there's been some pretty interesting things you mentioned of flips that are happening that are not great news for the Trump side of things. Yeah,
well, I mean, so the midterms are actually underway. So the primaries in Texas and a couple other states, early voting is underway. So we're in campaign season. What's interesting, I think, is that how tight the margins are. And I think that's still pretty reflective of how narrowly divided as a country we are. It's just you catch these swings and the velocity going pretty quickly. Historically, the president's first midterm, it's really, really rough for the president's party in power. President Trump's first midterm, they lost 40 seats in the House. Right now, it's a 1-seat margin in the House. Because of redistricting and a couple other things, Democrats probably projected right now to win about 20 seats, something like that. The Senate is very interesting. The Senate's 53-47 Republican controlled. Only a third of the Senate, give or take, is up every 2 years because they have 6-year terms. And so the map is really kind of your destiny here, right? Geography, and Republicans just have such a good map. The fact that we're even talking about how Democrats could win the Senate is, I think, pretty telling. One of the other things that's very interesting is that the Senate map really goes across the northern border, right? From Alaska to Maine, New Hampshire, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota. So the sensitivities, I think, to the U.S.-Canada trade relationship, you're going to see that in living color this fall.
How does that play out? I mean, again, I know prognostications are super hard in this because so many unusual things happen. But how are you kind of looking at it?
Well, right, just last week with the Gordie Howe Bridge,
Yeah.
right? Like Michigan was one of the races where Republicans felt like they maybe had a leg up a little bit, and by and large, that's, I mean, again, it's you know, it's 1 week, et cetera, but you know, something like 50,000 nurses come across the border every day in Detroit and Michigan hospitals. So, you know, the ads kind of write themselves.
Mm-hmm. What happens to President Trump and the administration if things flip? Maybe how to play that out.
Well, zooming out, bigger picture, the issues that really animate President Trump, you don't need Congress for those issues,
Right.
whether it's national security, trade policy, immigration policy.
Executive orders drive this.
Exactly. I mean, with the House, right, you would flip the committees. Those committees come with subpoena power. So, you know, investigations, you know, the two I words, investigations and impeachment. The Senate is a little bit more interesting in that the Senate confirms regulators, Fed governors, judges, et cetera. So if the Senate were to flip, that I think would be pretty significant. Right now, the Senate probably narrowly stays Republican, but let's see what happens in the Texas primary in a couple weeks and see what happens, you know, tomorrow.
Yeah, I know the one thing that was fascinating, I know that the last time we talked to you at the presidential elections was just how much is done through advanced polling, and and you said things are already underway. Like just how much voting has already happened, or like is there a sense just for the Canadians who don't know?
Sure. Well, so voting in the general election hasn't started yet.
Right.
So a handful of states are mail-in only. So
Yeah.
a state like Colorado, a state like Hawaii, these are mail-in only. The first state that begins early voting in the general election, I believe, is Minnesota, and I think that's sort of like mid to late September. But to get to the general election, you have to win your primary, right? So you have to be nominated by either the Democratic Party or Republican Party. And those primaries have begun. So we are in midterm season.
Yeah.
And Texas is really the big one that people should be watching. That's the first Tuesday in March.
All right, we will have it on our calendar. Let's talk about trade. You mentioned how that could like play into some of the Senate conversations, and let's talk about CUSMA.
Well, I mean, as you know, I have ambitions to be an honorary Canadian, but we have to call it USMCA.
I'm going to keep calling it CUSMA,
Yeah.
but anyway.
Yeah.
So, what are you expecting to play out of this? I mean, we've heard that obviously that trade talks are coming. Trump has been very public as he wants bilaterals. He's not really interested in.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it looks like Mark Carney is spearheading some pretty. It's almost like an everything but the United States trade war or trade pact.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think really since the World Series, it's sort of just been a stasis, right? Like nothing has really moved. I mean, there have been a lot of threats, but
Yeah.
nothing has fundamentally changed since October. We still have 232 tariffs in place on steel, aluminum, autos, copper, lumber, et cetera. The USMCA process is underway. July 1 is sort of a deadline. Our sense is they'll probably just continue the talks through to November. So I'd be surprised if there was a USMCA blow-up before November just because of the Senate. Once we get past November, I'm not as sure where we go. Having said all that, I mean, I think since October, the Prime Minister, whether it's the trip to Beijing with the EVs coming in, whether it's the speech in Davos, whether it's this discussion of creating a Trans-Pacific partnership via Ottawa into the EU trade framework, it's pretty remarkable that most of the action in the last 6 months has been in Ottawa, not in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Any other trade things you're watching? I know the CUSMA, again, we won't argue the title.
Sure.
But in terms of just what you're watching, certain things to happen with the U.S. and anyone else, right?
Well, I mean, I think that the big one of the year is probably the first week in April when President Trump goes to Beijing.
Yeah.
Right? Because at the end of the day, that is still, the fundamental truce.
Yeah.
That if something were to happen there, that's where we're back to April of last year. But by all accounts, it should be a relatively productive visit. President Xi has said he will visit the United States. After that trip, best guess is probably to the G20, which is in Miami at the end of the year. But yeah, stay tuned.